Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. Happy to be joined this week by Andy Bottoms, my favorite bracketologist. You also hear him on the Assembly Call, and he's also doing some bracketology work as well for the Field of 68. Andy, welcome back to the show. Always good to talk to you.
Hey, always a pleasure to be here. I appreciate you hosting my projections on the site again, and always good to chat with you. Especially when usually when we do this, IU is firmly entrenched in bubble discussion, and the level of anxiety is high for the fans. So we're a little bit safer this time.
Yeah, that's the first thing I was going to ask you. What's it like, as somebody that follows IU as closely as you have, and doing bracketology every year, to have the Hoosiers safely in the tournament now for the first time in many years? It's obviously a bit of a different feeling for you.
It definitely is, and it's funny. We would always get into some of those where they're one of the last teams, and last year being the most recent example of that. But it certainly wasn't the only example of that, and kind of feeling the weight of the fan base wanting to know whether they're going to be in, and it's like, I don't really know. I can tell you why I think they would be or wouldn't be, but and I find even when I'm doing things with them today from a seeding perspective, no matter where they are, it's a little bit tough to divorce yourself from, I've watched every minute of basketball this team has played this season, and you kind of form opinions that may or may not coincide with what the numbers that the committee's looking at would suggest. So I tend to feel like I'm probably harder on them than I maybe need to be, and maybe that's just trying to overcompensate for trying not to show bias in the other direction.
So that early bracket reveal that they did last weekend, obviously they had Indiana as the top 4 seed, which was a little bit interesting to me. Was that just based, in your opinion, on the fact that Indiana's got those 2 really strong road wins at Illinois and Xavier? Did that maybe help differentiate them from some of the teams that were in the same range?
Yeah, it felt that way. It was. I always kind of watch those and try to take some notes on what the committee chair is saying about the different teams as they talk through them, to see if you can take any little nuggets away that might be useful as you go through the remainder of the process. And Chris Reynolds really didn't say a whole lot about anybody, to be honest. He was pretty tight-lipped, pretty short with that. I'm sure some of that was just the fact that it was on TV and they're trying to get through a bunch of teams and wanting to do things like that. I joked that I did like how when Purdue came up, I feel like he basically said nothing about them at all. It just kind of moved on. So you didn't get a ton. I mean, what he did highlight with Alabama was their win at Houston, putting them over the top. When he talked about Houston, he talked about they won at Virginia. So if you're looking for a little bit of a drumbeat there, you do see what appears to be an emphasis placed on some of those quad 1A type wins. So, road wins in the top of, they split the quadrants, the top 2 quadrants on the team sheet. So you've got 1A, 1B, 2A, and 2B. And it did seem like, even if you look at a Kansas State, in that case, they hadn't really done a ton away from home, but they had 2 really good road wins against Texas and Baylor. And they end up on the 3 line, which was a little bit surprising. Iowa State, maybe you weren't sure that they would be there. They won at TCU, which falls in that category. So it did seem like there was some weight given to that. And when you look at the teams that were mentioned as being, the next teams on the 5 line, which would have been Creighton, Miami, St. Mary's, and UConn, none of them had a quad 1A win at the time. And the only other team on the 4 line that had one was Xavier by winning at UConn. So again, I don't know for sure that that's what put IU over the top. There's also some speculation as to whether the committee had finished their work before IU lost at Northwestern. I mean, my presumption was they had looked at all the results by then, but I know there's a couple of the other places they had teams made you wonder at least a little bit of whether that was there. So you don't know that either. But as best you could tell from what little was said and kind of looking at the resumes, it does feel like those high-end road wins carried some weight, maybe more so than they have in the past. Even though the committee has always been one to really highlight road wins and talk about the importance of being able to win away from home.
That whole exercise, I'm curious from your perspective as somebody that, you make a preseason bracket, and I know once January comes around, you're making weekly brackets and trying to stay up on everything. How valuable is that exercise for you, if at all? And would you like to see maybe the listing of last 4 in, first 4 out? Would would that be more valuable to you than seeing the top of the bracket, or do you think there would even be any value in seeing a full bracket at this point in time?
I mean, I think there definitely, from my perspective, there would be value from it. It might be overkill for people that would provide a lot of content, but from my perspective, being able to look down the list and really see some things, because the parts of the bracket this year that are hard to parse out, it's kind of that 7 to 10 range, 8 to 10 range. There's a lot of teams in there that look pretty similarly versus, you probably learned a little bit by looking at who was on the 3 line and the 4 line last weekend, but the 1s and the 2s, short of the order for of those, and Houston maybe being a bit higher and maybe UCLA being a bit lower than people thought overall, you didn't learn a lot because at this point those teams had kind of separated themselves a little bit. So, and it then really only allows you to learn stuff from a couple of the seed lines, and even those were not crazy. So I personally would get a lot more out of that. I also think doing some of the last 4 in type stuff would create some other intrigue around the sport and some other talking points. And one other thing that's been done over the course of time in the women's game is they've done multiple. I think they just had another one yesterday. I'm not sure at what point it becomes overkill. I mean, theirs is pretty interesting because it's really close to the end of the regular season, and they just put out the one this week. So I don't know that you'd ever get to that. This one is kind of somewhat of a made for TV event. It always waits till after the Super Bowl and is almost serves as a means of catching people up who haven't been paying attention to college basketball until the NFL season ended. So if that's really the main utility of it for the general public, then maybe they don't make some changes to that. But I certainly would get something out of it being a bit more in-depth and or a bit more frequent.
Yeah, I'm just thinking from the perspective of getting interest in the sport. It kind of feels like there's a lot of people who just kind of come in after the NFL season ends and maybe don't pay as closely attention as we do. The Indiana fan base is unique in that, we're analyzing exhibition games in late October and early November, and there's a lot of people that are more casual observers of the sport. And you look at what the college football playoff does with the weekly reveals of the rankings. Obviously, it would be a heavy lift to have something like that for a tournament bracket, and there's a lot of work that goes into it, as you know, being on the mock committee before in the past, being able to produce the bracket. I just wonder if there's something more that they could do for the health of the sport in general, because you look at, obviously the tournament still does great, but to me there feels like there's some missed opportunities just in terms of getting people more engaged as the season goes along. But maybe I'm speaking from someone that covers one of the 5 or 6 most diehard fan bases in the country, that we sometimes feel like we can't put enough information out there for people, and maybe there's just not the interest in it. But with how the tournaments go ahead.
Yeah, one of the other things that would probably, if I put myself in the NCAA shoes, one of the things that would be difficult about that to do, especially to get to the last 4 in conversation, is you'd really have to go through the whole process at that point. And so that part becomes a lot more time consuming as you go through the voting and the different waves of voting that you do. And I think the NCAA, Andy Katz was the one who narrated a lot of it, but I think David Warlock they put some things out in the off season that spoke a little bit more to the process. So in order to get to the last 4, you got to do everything. And so if you didn't truly follow the voting procedures and the normal things that you would do from that standpoint, would you run the risk? So you either do that, it takes a lot of time, or you don't do that, and then you provide a list that, maybe in reality is not as accurate as it might seem. And all of a sudden things changed in a couple of weeks, or when you reveal the field, and it's like, well, what the heck were you doing when you sent me this? So I can see why you wouldn't want to go down that far. But I do think even to do the top 4 on a more regular basis, like what they've done in the women's game, I think could do some things to drum up some interest and do some of that. So maybe there's a middle ground outside of having to get where you're doing everything. But if I think about it from their perspective, there's probably prohibitive for people who have actual jobs in college athletics to be able to go in and sit down and really go through a process that typically takes a good number of hours and days to do when the end of the season rolls around.
Right. So looking at the Big Ten right now, in general as a league, I know you don't do this in your projections, but a lot of the bubble watch lists that come out, they like to put teams in a lock status that, they're definitely going to be in regardless of what happens the rest of the way. From your perspective right now, because I want to talk about some of these bubble teams and what lies ahead for them and maybe where they're going to fit in here. From a Big Ten perspective, which teams would you have right now as locks to make the field?
I think at this point you'd have, Purdue certainly. I think if you go through general order of teams where they'd be on the seed list right now, I think IU would probably be the second highest seed with Northwestern behind them. I think you feel good about all of those. And then you get into this group where I mentioned this on the assembly call last night, but it's changed slightly today. But if you look on the bracket matrix between Northwestern, who's the second 6 seed, as I'm looking at this right now, by the time people listen to this, it might be different, in the last 8 seed. So basically that's a span of 11 teams. There are 6 Big Ten teams there. Now, last night there was 6 teams in the span of 8 spots. And so you look through that, that's the area of the bracket I mentioned before is a little bit of a mess. But I think you look through there, Northwestern is there, Illinois feels safe, Maryland feels safe. They've done a lot of work at home. I think their seed could be impacted by the fact they haven't beaten anyone of note on the road. And maybe that's something they can rectify in the Big Ten tournament, but they feel safe. Michigan State is safe. Iowa, I would put in that category. And then I'd probably draw the line at lock before you get to Rutgers at this point. And I think there's work, well, I guess maybe work to do, and the opposite of work to do, that they'd have to fall off pretty poorly to fall out of the field. But if you look at them right now, they're only 17-11. They're 3-6 in true road games. The strength of schedule, the non-conference strength of schedule is not very good. Even the average of their resume metrics, which is KPI and strength of record, is only 47. So the flip side of that is they got 5 quad 1 wins and 3 more in quad 2. They do have a couple quad 3 losses, which don't help. But again, I feel like they would almost have to lose their remaining regular season games and then lose their first game of the Big Ten tournament to make that a reality for them. But I don't think they're as safe as the others. And one of the games they play is at Minnesota. If you lose out and lose that game, I think maybe you deserve to be left out. I don't know, though IU had a close game there, as everyone knows. But they've got at Penn State, at Minnesota, and then Northwestern at home. So I think as long as they win one of those, they feel okay. But I don't know that means they escape Dayton or being right on the cusp of Dayton if they lose one of the first games. So they're kind of the one in the middle. And then you look at the true bubble teams, I would put Wisconsin in that category. They are in the field at this point. Every time I put together a bracket, some of their metrics suggest you're not going to put them in again. And then you look and they've got a good enough number of quality wins at this point. They've got 6 quad 1 wins compared to other teams on the bubble. That number stands out. So they are not safe by any means, but at least if they're on the right side of the cut line as it stands today. And then you've got Penn State and Michigan who are in the mix as well. Michigan and Wisconsin play over the weekend, so I think that game becomes a really important one, potentially, for both teams, but certainly for Michigan. They're further away from the cut line at this point than a Penn State would be, probably more in I haven't finished going through my seed list quite yet today, but probably more in like a next 4 out type category. But with Michigan, they've got as good an opportunities as anybody to really play themselves back on the other side. They host Wisconsin and then they go to Illinois and to Indiana. Now, those are 3 games they could lose as well, so they could play themselves right out of it. But at least, if you're not on the right side of it at this point, what you want is the opportunity to show people that you can play with teams. That's kind of what IU was able to do last year in the Big Ten tournament. So they're one that's kind of intriguing to watch. And then Penn State, I think, is probably more in the first 4 out type group at this point. They've got Rutgers at home, at Maryland, or at Northwestern, and then home to Maryland left. So again, 3 games against tournament caliber teams for them to really have a chance to prove themselves. 2 of which come at home. So if you're those teams, you like the fact that you have those opportunities, and we have this conversation in another week to 10 days. You'll have a lot better picture based on how they do in those games and where they would be. So a lot of Big Ten teams still in the conversation at this point, with really only a few that have eliminated themselves as of now.
A couple of things with Rutgers stand out to me, and I want you to maybe tell me from a bracketology standpoint if these matter at all when the committee is evaluating teams, or if it's something that you're looking at the full body of work. But the fact that Rutgers is now without a starter for the rest of the season, he's out for the year. Obviously, they've now lost 3 or 4, are actually 4 or 5, 4 or 5. Indiana, Illinois, Nebraska, and they barely beat Wisconsin on the road, and they lose at home to Michigan. Kind of suggests that they're a different team without Mawat Mag, I believe is how you say his name.
Mm-hmm.
He's not coming back, and I wonder how that impacts how they're viewed going forward, if at all, and also just the recent form in general. I think a lot of that's been a long-standing talking point of bracketing, but correct me if I'm wrong. Not necessarily the the last 10 type situation that used to be looked at. That's kind of out the window at this point right now when you're evaluating a team.
Yeah, they don't look at that anymore. The injury stuff is always a little nebulous to me in terms of how they choose to apply it. They would say without question that they look at it, and as they should, and as you would expect. I think it's a little bit easier to look at when you have a guy who is out for the rest of the season. And in this case, you've got a little bit of a sample size to see what they look like without him. Now, he's not the star of the team either, so it's a little bit different than what you'd look at and say, hey, this team's going to, I think the best example anybody had was UC way back in the day when Kenyon Martin got hurt.
Right.
You didn't have a big sample size, but you knew he was one of the best players, so you knew that they would get dinged a little bit in that regard. So, as a starter, but a role player, a little bit interesting to see. But the committee is, at this point, based on when his injury occurred, able to see what this team looks like without him. And so I think you can make a little bit more of a judgment on that if you wanted to in that scenario than you would hey, this guy missed some games over the course of the season. Would you have won those games without him? So let's use Tyler Wall with Wisconsin for that this year. You can't assume that they would have won certain games if he was there, because they've lost maybe games that you would have expected them not to lose with him in the lineup. And that always happened. Notre Dame was a good example a few years ago when Matt Farrell and Bonzie Colson missed some games. And it's like, well, that's all well and good, but they lost to, I forget who it was, but they lost to a really bad team when those guys were all healthy. So you then can't flip that and say, well, if they had these guys, then we should count that as a win, or would look at that differently. So that's where it gets to be a slippery slope for guys that have been in and out. With one who's out, I think you would look at that and maybe push them down a little bit more than you might, than maybe their resume would otherwise dictate. But for them, if they continue to play poorly on the stretch, it may not matter, as they have that. And they've had other injuries over the course of the season too, with Mulcahy missing some games. I think Caleb McConnell missed a game not too long ago. They actually won that one when he was out against Wisconsin. But he missed some games early in the season. So they've had a lot of ins and outs in terms of injury that make their profile a little bit tougher to look at.
Yeah, and they're also in the middle of a little bit of controversy right now. I'm not sure, Andy, if you've seen this, but they obviously played on Thursday night at home, lost to Michigan, and Michigan State obviously trying to make up a game against Minnesota. And I think the only kind of proposed way for that game to happen was for Rutgers to agree to move its game at Minnesota to Tuesday. They play there on Thursday, and last night after the game, Steve Peichel said basically that it wasn't going to work out from a logistical standpoint for Rutgers, and this is kind of one of those things where you can see both sides of the arguments from all parties involved. Obviously, Michigan State dealt with a tragic situation that forced them to cancel a game. And from the Rutgers perspective, they're kind of clinging on for dear life here and trying to make the tournament. And I can understand from Steve Peichel's perspective, not wanting to play at Penn State and then turning around, on less than 48 hours rest and playing at Minnesota on Tuesday. So that's kind of a storyline here as we go into the last week of the Big Ten schedule that's kind of playing out, and obviously just an unfortunate situation all around that it's occurring, and we'll see how that plays out. But from a Rutgers perspective, you look at that Minnesota game, that's really a game they need to win, right? I mean, they got to go to Penn State, which probably not a game they're going to be favored to win, and then they have Northwestern at home. So you can
Yeah,
see
that
from their
Minnesota game
perspective.
only hurts you if you're Rutgers, and so
Yeah, and if you
you
have a
put
chance
yourself
to
in his
play,
shoes. You want to give yourself your best chance to win that game, because if you lose it, it hurts you a lot more than it helps you
exactly.
than it helps you to win it.
Yep, it's obviously not a good situation in general. How would that impact from a Michigan State perspective? Um, I guess from their perspective, it's not a win that's going to help them, but maybe it would help them from Big Ten tournament seeding perspective to get that game in. I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure.
Win would help.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure if they lose, or if you play less games, they look at winning percentage, and so
Yeah, I think that's right. If you have the same number of losses, then you end up hurting yourself. And given the number of teams that have around the number of losses that they do,
right? For them, it could be the difference
important
between 6 or 7, or 3 or 4. Who knows? Depending on, and they have a pretty big. They have two pretty big games coming up next week. Obviously, at Iowa and at Nebraska. For Big Ten tournament seeding purposes. I want to talk now, about a little bit more in depth about some of these other Big Ten bubble teams. Wisconsin right now seem, as you mentioned, their quad one wins have kind of put them in a pretty good position. What do they kind of have to do here the rest of the way to feel good about themselves going in to the Big Ten tournament? And the other kind of question I have on this, based on what we saw last season with Indiana in the Big Ten tournament, they picked up those 2 really impressive wins over Michigan and Illinois, and it didn't bump them out of Dayton. Are some of these teams from the Big Ten maybe looking at a situation where they could have to go to Dayton regardless of what happens in Chicago?
Hard to say right now. I think Wisconsin, if you look at where they are just from where they rank in the net, and some of the other metrics from their standpoint, particularly as you look at some of the predictive metrics, they don't rate out well there at all. They're 64th in BPI and 64th in KenPom, and even only 47th in Sagarin. And even the resume metrics are not great. Now, they've worked their way up to 70th in the net, which wouldn't be the lowest that anybody's ever made it at by any means. But you look at some of those things, it does point a little bit toward a team that's potentially in that range. So dependent upon how these last few games shake out for them, I think you could see them there. Now, if they're able to, so if you look at if the only game they win down the stretch of the regular season is at Minnesota in the season finale, but they lose at Michigan, they lose at home to Purdue, at that point you're 17-13. You're only 4 games over 500. Yeah, from a Big Ten tournament perspective, I think one win there maybe helps you feel safer, but may not help you move totally out of that last 4 in. And that depends a lot on bid thieves and all that stuff when you get down to that point. But I think the earlier you win those games in the Big Ten tournament, probably the more important that it is. And I would imagine if IU had beaten Iowa in the semifinals last year, maybe that keeps them out of Dayton. But it certainly feels, as you look through this year every year, that those games matter, but not as much as maybe the folks on TV make you think that it matters.
Right.
And I think IU being able to get one of those wins on the Thursday probably helps, because maybe that's a point in time when it matters a little bit more.
Yeah. When you look at Wisconsin's, just at their KenPom page, and you look at what they've actually accomplished in the calendar year 2023, they're one of those teams where the whole body of work is obviously very helpful for them, because in this calendar year, their wins are Minnesota at home, Penn State at home, at Ohio State, at Penn State, Michigan at home, Iowa at home. But there's really not a lot of meat on that bone. And I know they've dealt with some injuries, but they're, to me, a team that really is going to be an interesting case just to see where they end up. Michigan.
Yeah, the part with them was one other quick thing that's interesting is if you take, again, what we talked about before with the committee and what it seemed like they liked, then you look at true road wins at Marquette and at Iowa, and you think, man, that really helps Wisconsin a lot. The flip side of that is we talked about the last 10 games not really holding as much weight. UConn was the team that, if anybody thought somebody got snubbed, that was who they thought it was. And they had done a lot of work early in the season, but had not played well of late. And again, you're connecting dots. You don't know what the discussion was, right. But there were a couple folks who said, for as much as they say those don't matter, there were a couple teams where it felt like, but does it matter a little bit?
It has to.
And that
It
was
has to
something
come
that,
in to it
yeah,
a
that was
little
something
bit.
that could have benefited IU. That could have been one of the reasons, because at that point IU had, was in their stretch of playing some of their best basketball of this season. Even if you included the Northwestern loss, they were still playing really well in that stretch. And does that elevate them a little bit? So the committee's not going to tell you that, because they've said that's not what the criteria is. But so again, that's where trying to parse out what they say and do, even within this reveal, gets a little bit tough, because there's parts of the things that you think they like that help Wisconsin. There's parts of the things that you think they consider that don't help them at all. And you're kind of left as, well, maybe that nets out to a team that goes to Dayton.
Yeah, I mean, anytime you've got human beings in a room debating something, regardless of what the rules are, there's going to have to be some type of bias or something that comes into it, because there's a lot of teams on the cut line or near the cut line, or as you mentioned, some of the seeds like below like 7 or 8. A lot of these resumes look pretty similar. So you've got to use something to distinguish these teams from one another. And I don't know how you could ignore the fact of like how a team's been playing lately and totally throw that out. Whether or not they're actually supposed to do that, to me, it seems like it has to be at least part of the conversation. Michigan, to me, is just a really interesting team, because you look at where they are in the Big Ten standings, and they're right. They're 10-7. They're in the mix of teams that, has, competing at this point for a double bye in the Big Ten tournament, depending on what they can do the rest of the way. They've got a home game, obviously this weekend against Wisconsin. That's big. And then they've got opportunities at Illinois and at Indiana. If they can win one or both of those games, all of a sudden they're a conversation for a tournament bid becomes much more legitimate. But then you look at kind of the non-conference and what they were able to do there, and it wasn't much at all. I mean, they beat Pittsburgh pretty handily on a neutral court, and then lose. They got smoked by Arizona State on a neutral court. Lost at home to Virginia. Lost to Kentucky over in London, lost to North Carolina, which at that point in time, you're like, oh, that's probably not a bad loss. Well, North Carolina's not doing so hot either. And then the backbreaker was the home loss to Central Michigan, which you just never want to see a blemish like that on the resume. Michigan, it kind of felt like after they lost the Indiana and Wisconsin games, maybe they were done. Now they've bounced back and beaten Michigan State and Rutgers. Where are you at right now on the Wolverines, just in general, and what hypothetically do they need to do to maybe get on the right side of the cut line here with a little less than 2 weeks left in the season?
Yeah, I think you summed it up well. The non-conference doesn't help them at all. I think the Pittsburgh win looks a lot better than you thought it would earlier in the season, as they've continued to be a good basketball team. And the Kentucky one has probably looked better and worse at various times over the last few weeks, depending upon how Kentucky's been playing. And so, outside the Central Michigan loss is really bad. Obviously, I'm not breaking any ground by saying that, but even to lose to, Virginia, Kentucky, North Carolina, not terrible. Arizona State has faded a lot, so losing to them by 25 doesn't look great. And then you get into the Big Ten, though. They've been able to get some good wins. They've got Maryland at home, Michigan State at home, swept Northwestern. Those are really their 4 conference wins, and then winning at Rutgers yesterday are their wins of note. The unbalanced schedule in the Big Ten, and in general, the committee would say the conference record doesn't matter. So the fact that they're 10-7 is not a huge deal. But I kind of thought what you did. They had some momentum coming in that IU game, had won 3 straight. Seemed like maybe they're starting to right the ship. Then they dropped those couple games, and it felt like, all right, well, maybe that's not going to, this is it for them. And so credit to them for bouncing back to win these last 2. Given their last 3 games, home against Wisconsin, at Illinois, at Indiana, you win that home game, take one of the 2 road games. Those are going to give you 2 more quad 1-2 type victories and help you out in that regard. And then I think the Big Ten tournament becomes another one that is somewhat important for them. Right now, though, they're 3-10 in quad 1. So they've had a ton of opportunities to show that they can beat good teams, and they have seldom taken advantage of that as well. And so that's where it gets a little dicey when you look at it that way. But I think the home game against Wisconsin is a must. That would, if they lose that, then they've been swept by Wisconsin. They say head-to-head doesn't matter a ton, but if you sweep somebody and you're pretty close to them on the seed list by the time it's all said and done, that becomes a hard thing to overcome. And then I think being able to win Another marquee road game would be good. Two of their quad one wins are on the road against Rutgers and Northwestern. So again, you think back to what it seems like the committee likes, that would be a positive as you look at it that way. And so I think going 2-1 in that stretch makes them a fairly compelling case heading into the Big Ten tournament. I think anything less than that, they'd have to make a pretty deep run there.
Probably like two wins maybe in the Big Ten. If they only go 1-2, depending on who they play,
yeah,
they're going to need at least two wins. Last team that kind of the same situation, maybe not the same situation as Michigan, but Penn State had dropped 4 in a row. They lost it at Nebraska, then the tough overtime home loss to Wisconsin, then losing at Maryland, which is no shame in that based on how the Terps have played at home this season in Big Ten play. They bounced back. They beat Illinois at home, and then they beat Minnesota and Ohio State on the road. Not that those are great wins by any means, but those are games that they at least had to win to get themselves back in the conversation. And now it kind of feels like they've got an opportunity here. They've got Rutgers at home. Rutgers is struggling at Northwestern, and then Maryland at home to close the regular season. Maryland's not been a good road team. So, Penn State could have 19 wins going into the Big Ten tournament. I know obviously the volume of wins doesn't matter, but their resume overall, I mean, they've got the regular season sweep of Illinois, which is good. They beat Indiana at home. Michigan at home, I guess, is a solid win. What do you see right now with Penn State, just in general, in terms of their prospects, and what do they have to do here the rest of the way to give themselves a chance? I mean, they're looking at a scenario where they could be 10 or 11 seed in the Big Ten tournament, give themselves a chance to maybe play a couple, maybe that one extra game on Wednesday. I don't know how much it would even matter playing potentially in Minnesota, but you kind of wonder there getting another win, how that could impact them as well.
Yeah, theirs is somewhat of an odd profile. That they rate pretty much the same, right around 50th, and whether it's the resume metrics or the predictive metrics. You look and they've won just 3 total road games on the season, but one of those came at Illinois, so that's a really quality win there. Came at Illinois by 15. The other 2 are Ohio State and Minnesota, which don't really do a whole lot for you, even though the Ohio State one is somehow still a quad one win at this point. I don't think it will be for too long. The bigger issue for them is they didn't really do anything in the non-conference, and it wasn't even that they lost to the better teams that they played. I mean, they did that to a certain extent. They lost to Virginia Tech and they lost to Clemson, and that was at least 1 overtime, maybe 2. But their best non-conference win came against Furman, which is actually a quad 2 win because it came on a neutral court. They just didn't do a lot in the non-conference. Non-conference strength of schedule is 288th. They just didn't really help themselves in that part of the schedule. But they have a couple solid home wins against Indiana.
Well, they beat Iowa too.
Iowa and Michigan. So they've got kind of 4 good home wins. The 1 really good road win at Illinois. So I think they've shown they can compete with teams. It's just nothing from a metric standpoint jumps out and pushes them way up. Nothing from a non-conference standpoint pushes them way up. But they're, I would say they're probably first 4 out type category right now. And I think, again, probably a little bit similar to Michigan. You go 2-1 in these games, even if you lose at Northwestern, given a not great road record, but beating Rutgers and Maryland at home, I think makes a pretty compelling case for them heading into the Big Ten tournament. I think it's just, I don't know that you're going to get 10 of these teams in because enough of them are going to lose, but I could see one of, maybe 2 of the 3 out of Wisconsin, Penn State, Michigan making it. I just don't, all 3 feels like a stretch because I don't think they could all do well enough in the Big Ten tournament based on how jumbled that part of it is to really do it. But I guess that's possible and very hard to tell right now, given how much movement there could still be in the seeding for the Big Ten tournament.
Yeah, it also feels like maybe if that were to happen, a team like Rutgers could be, left in the, if Rutgers doesn't win another game or something crazy like that, they could be a team that maybe falls out. I agree with you. I don't necessarily see 10 teams. I guess 9 teams seems realistic, right? At this point,
I think
it
so.
could happen. Where do you kind of come down on the whole argument of that we're going to get, because I know my timeline on Twitter is going to be full of this in a couple of less than a couple weeks when the brackets actually announced, and let's say the Big Ten does get 9 teams, and then there's some smaller conference team that loses its conference tournament that has a really good record, but they didn't get a chance to play anybody. And then all the national people are tweeting out, hey, this coach tried to play 10 games in the non-conference and nobody would play them. And how'd you put Michigan in? They lost at home to Central. This is inevitably going to happen. Where do you kind of come down on this whole argument of these power conference teams getting rewarded based on the sheer volume of opportunities compared to, let's say, a team from a smaller conference that maybe wins 25 games, loses in their conference tournament, and gets left out as a result of that?
It's always the hardest part of doing bracketology to me, because the ability to compare teams like that is incredibly difficult. And you can use some of the metrics, and that can help a little bit with some of the tempo-free things and some of the predictive metrics, but it's always really, really hard to compare. I liken it a little bit to like when I'm at work and it's time to do performance reviews, and our whole team rolls up somewhere, and I know what my team did, but the job of somebody else that works on the team of one of my peers is a totally different job. How do you compare those? And if you say, oh, this person exceeded expectations, well, so did this person. Well, how do I compare those two together to kind of rate out this person needs to get this rating? It totally is the same type of thing. I think we've seen at times the committee throw a bone to one of the little guys at times. I think Belmont was one that made the first four a couple years ago, and that was the scenario. It is hard to even look historically at what the precedent is for some of them to say, oh, well, this is the threshold that you have to clear in order to be a mid-major team that gets in. So I don't know that I really have a good answer, but that always is the hardest part of this for me. And so I think being able to at least have a couple of those quad one type wins, maybe even three in the top two quadrants. And if you're 3-3 in that scenario, even if none of them are, so using like Florida Atlantic as this year, I think they have 3 quad 1 and 2 wins, and they might be 3-3 in those quadrants. Like that to me shows at least enough versus, oh, I was 1-3 in the top two quadrants, or 1-2 as those teams, and I managed to only get one win there. It's like, could you have, and again, that's a hard bar to ask them to clear because they may not have had those opportunities, but were you able to, at least on more than one occasion, show that you were able to beat quote unquote tournament level teams? And is that it? But it's super difficult because you throw out just aggregate numbers of, oh, they've got, Big 12 will be this, a lot of this is going to come up when you talk Oklahoma State, West Virginia. Well, they have even Texas Tech kind of working their way back into the conversation now. Well, they have 6, quad 1 wins. Well, they're 6-13 in, the top two quadrants. So you had 19 chances and you won a third of them. Like, is that good enough? I don't know. And I don't think the committee's ever really been able to articulate how they view some of that stuff. So kind of leaves you in the dark a little bit to guess.
Do you think the quads are too broad in terms of how, like isn't a quad 1 road game
like 1-75?
5. So there's a big difference between winning at Ohio State and winning at Purdue, right? I mean, there are differentiators between like 1A, right? Something like that. But
yeah, so like 1A is 1-40 in road wins at least, and only 1-15 for home games, versus 1B is 16-30 for home games and 41-75 there. So I think that helps that a little bit. And the other thing that the committee will do, and a lot of people that do bracketology will reference, is wins against the field. So basically looking at and saying, against the at-large teams that I have in the mix, and sometimes I'll even include my last 4 out just to kind of give a little bit of a buffer there. Like, what was your record against those teams? How many of those teams did you beat? Because you get into some of these, a Pac-12 has a lot of this right now. There's a bunch of teams that are not good enough, but most of the good teams there have a ton of quad 2 wins because a lot of their road games against these teams fall into that. So I think it's a way to categorize, but if the committee's doing the job they're supposed to be doing, they're getting into a little bit more depth of that and using these. Now, they don't split all the quads that way, but they do the top 2. And I think that's helpful because you can, a lot of times the quad 2B teams are almost always not teams who would be in the tournament. So do you take and kind of split that, add those up a little bit? I think there's ways to mitigate that, because no matter what you do, you're always going to have somebody that's right on the other side of the cut line, and you're always going to be to complain and be like, well, this should be 70 instead of 75. And different stuff like that. So I think the way they split those helps to mitigate that a bit.
Last thing, Andy, I want to ask you just about Indiana right now. The form that they're playing in right now as a team, I guess how do you feel Indiana's playing right now? To me, it seems like they've not played their best basketball in this recent stretch, but they've been able to kind of hold on here with this obviously a tough stretch going 4 out of 5 on the road. I wouldn't expect them to win at Purdue this weekend, but obviously anything can happen. And then these two home games coming up next week are pretty important. Just in general, your thoughts on how this team's playing and maybe what you're going to be watching these next 3 games as they go into tournament play to maybe give you a feeling of what direction the season may ultimately go.
It's hard as an IU fan to look at this team because, like you said when we first got on here, it's like, man, it's refreshing to not feel like you're going to get put through the ringer over the last couple of weeks and be in every first 4 or last 4 in, first 4 out conversation and those kinds of things, and that's awesome. And then you flip around and you're kind of like, man, this team really hasn't played all that great in some of these recent games. Now, the flip side is compared to other recent vintages of IU teams, they've actually been able to win some of those games when they weren't playing their best. And so, you could look at it's a glass half full, glass half empty type of conversation at that point of, am I grateful that they're winning games when they're not playing well, or am I frustrated because they're not playing as well as they could? And the truth probably is somewhere in the middle. I think right now, and we've talked about this just looks like a team who's got a handful of guys just running on fumes at this point based on the amount of minutes that they have had to log. And a lot of that has come on road games. I think whether that's Woodson not trusting certain guys to play as much. We talked about this on the show a little bit last night. In some ways, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy of, you put some of the guys in who haven't played very much. They don't play well. You got to go back to the starters, and then you ride those guys out and you think this is my only way to win this game. Is that fair? I don't really know, but I think Woodson was in a spot after they had played really poorly in early to mid-January where you got to do whatever you can to win games. And so what is proven in his mind to win games and what is proven on the court to win games is I'm just riding TJD and Jalen Hood-Schifino for as many minutes as they can handle because those guys have to play great in order for IU to win. And I think that has happened in some ways at the expense of, guys on the bench and maybe getting some other development opportunities. You also look at that and the way this offense works. Nobody else is getting a ton of shots. So even if those guys played more, I'm not sure that they would they truly get development opportunities or would they just get minutes? And I don't think we know that. And at this point of the season, when you're 30 games in, I don't think it really matters a whole lot. So this team needs something to inject them with some energy. And that the obvious thing for that is Xavier Johnson, who solves a lot of things for this team. 1, gives another ball handler. 2, gives you a spark. Whether you bring him off the bench or Galloway off the bench, you're then bringing someone off the bench that you feel like what you're going to get from them on a night in and night out basis when there's nobody at this point that's coming off the bench that what you're going to get from them on a night in and night out basis. So solves a couple issues. 1, in terms of being able to give particularly the guards a bit more rest. 2, having another guy who can put the ball in the basket, and 3, giving yourself a little bit more impact coming off the bench. So now, based on Woodson's comments yesterday, when he comes back is still unknown. But I do think that's something that can inject a little bit of life into this team. And a lot of the role players play better at home. So take the Purdue game out of the mix. I think you're going to see the starters play a ton as long as the game is close. But I think when you come back home, can you have a couple guys get a spark there? We saw that from Tamar Bates in the Michigan State game. He's really, really struggled since then. But can he get hot in one of these games and get a little bit of confidence going into the Big Ten tournament and the NCAA tournament and things like that? But I think they need somebody to be able to step up there to be able to allow for a little bit of rest. The question for us for the last few weeks has been how sustainable is it to play guys this many minutes and keep doing what you're doing. I don't know that I'm ready to say it's the last couple games have proven that it's not sustainable, but it certainly makes you raise an eyebrow and question whether it is. So I think all in all, it's been a good thing. And IU just hasn't had the rest. Jared put some stuff out yesterday about how the Big Ten conference schedule has been. And to the extent that you believe that you could have gotten guys some rest, had you played more of the lower teams in the league, maybe you could have, maybe you couldn't have. Again, IU didn't play great against Minnesota, so maybe that's a point that's not valid. But If you got a couple more of those teams at home, could you have given them more rest during the season versus you played almost all the top teams twice, and the breathing room that you had in games was so minimal that you couldn't do it? Hard to say for sure. And like I said before, honestly, doesn't make a whole lot of difference at this point.
Yeah, not to get into another conversation about the scheduling of the Big Ten in general. While I love the fact that there's so many Big Ten games, 20 of them to be exact, I almost think that it can be a detriment at times for the league that they play so many games, because there's other conferences that aren't playing as many league games, and it's in a league this year that's so competitive outside of really Minnesota, and obviously Ohio State has really fallen on tough times this season. There's really no just gimmies on the schedule. You look at a league like the SEC or the ACC specifically, there's 4 or 5 teams where if you're an IU fan, you're like, man, I'd love to go to Boston College. Although that's maybe a bad example. Virginia just lost there, but Georgia Tech, Louisville, Florida State, these teams are just not anywhere near the caliber of even a Nebraska this year in the Big Ten. So there's you're going to play 20 games and you're going to have 13 teams that basically can beat anybody on a given night, maybe 12 this year. This is kind of what happens. And every year we're going to have these conversations about the unbalanced schedule. I used to do a post kind of when the schedule came out, trying to handicap who had the easiest and toughest schedule. But then if it would have done something like that this year, and you looked at Ohio State,
like it was a positive to only play Ohio State once. Yeah. And,
right.
And I think to only, play Maryland once would have been like, oh, maybe I'd like to play them a second time.
Twice. So right. And then all of a sudden Maryland can't lose it. You're like, before the season, you probably looked at Maryland on the road and you're like, well, that's the winnable game.
That's a winnable road game. 100%.
Won there last year, and now Maryland's beating Purdue at home. So it's impossible to it's good for the league, good for basketball fans that we have this much content to consume there's always a game on. But I do think there's something to the fact that by the end of the season, you're beat up and worn out, and then you're going to go do it again in Chicago for 5 days. Well,
the other thing with IU is, to the extent that you say they have a bye week, theirs essentially came in early January because they didn't play a Big Ten game until January 5th when others did. But since then, they've had a weekday game and a weekend game every single week. Versus you look at Purdue heading into the game, they haven't played all week. Maybe that helps IU because they're rusty. Who knows? But that's a heck of a time to get some rest late in the season, and certainly something that this IU team could use a lot of. And again, based on the way the schedule played out, just didn't get. So we can,
for sure,
I'm sure, submit our suggestions and complaints directly to the Big Ten, where they will be.
You can, Andy,
be thrown out immediately. But
I hear there's a commissioner job open. You can put your name in the hat. We can solve the officiating. We can solve the unbalanced schedule. Get a lot of things done.
I'll fill out my application. Yeah, there's definitely some officiating things I'd probably do as my first acts, but anybody who follows me on Twitter probably can get a pretty good idea of what those would be.
For sure. Andy, always good to talk to you. Follow Andy on Twitter at Andy Bottoms. He's also on the Assembly Call. You can also find him on the Field of 68. You can also read his Bracketology at Inside the Hall. Andy, thanks for making the time. We really appreciate it.
Hey, always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
As for Podcast on the Brink, we will be back next week at some point with another episode. Indiana, obviously 3 regular season games to go. They go to Purdue this weekend before hosting Iowa and Michigan next week to close out the regular season. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a review or a rating on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a rating on Spotify. And we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.